Welcome to R&R Living Life. We start this 2024 chapter by making our way through southern Queensland, New South Wales and into South Australia. Our first day was a long day travelling through the shires of Toowoomba, Goondiwindi, Moree Plains and then into the Walgett Shire, so we were glad to pull up to camp for the night at Coloranabri. Most of the journey today was over roads that we had previously travelled, but seeing it going south always featured something new. Again, we found that the countryside was forever changing. Rick and I spent time talking about the various cropping, grazing, forest types and agricultural practices, including cotton and wheat farming, sheep and beef cattle breeding. It is interesting to see the change in tree species depending on soil types and the different environments and conditions as the scenery changed before us. Mother Nature also plays a part in what we see, from good seasons where rain has fallen and regenerated the countryside, to patches where it is still in need of a good drink. On leaving Toowoomba, we travel along the Gore Highway that passes through the Darling Downs region of Queensland, alongside sorghum crops in various stages of ripeness, skimming the edges of towns such as Athol, Southbrook and Pittsworth, and on through to Mulmerran. From Mulmerran, we continued on the Gore Highway until shortly before entering Goondiwindi, where the Gore Highway merges into the Leichhardt Highway, which continues into the border town. Interestingly enough, Goondiwindi is at the junction of the Barwon, Bruxner, Cunningham and Leichhardt highways. On the banks of the McIntyre River, Goondiwindi was the first of our many fuel stops. On leaving Goondiwindi, we crossed the McIntyre River and were now in New South Wales. In Boggabilla, we then took the Newell Highway to Moree, our first time change for the trip. We were now on daylight savings time. The highway was quite rough in places due to water damage and the surface having sunk in places. On arriving in Moree, we stopped at the Apex Park for lunch and a rest break, then topped up with fuel before continuing along the Gwydir Highway to Coloranabri. The Mihai River and floodplains follow the highway for most of this leg before it entered the Barwon River north of Coloranabri. The highway was flood affected with rough edges. In places, the feed had dried off and some crops were in need of water. Our camp the first night was just 40 kilometres south of the Queensland border at Coloranabri, where we camped in the RV park at the Sports Oval just out of town. We had camped here before, so knew what to expect, though I must admit to an increase in traffic going past, but that did not worry us during the night. We took a walk just before sundown along the Barwon River, so peaceful and relaxing. Unfortunately, we did not see any water rats this time. The rocky ford on the Barwon River once provided a hard-bottom, shallow river crossing for stock and pioneer travellers in yesteryears. After a good night's sleep, only being disturbed by mosquitoes early in the morning, we continued on our way along the Gwydir Highway to just north of Walgett, where we joined the Castlereagh Highway. Our first stop today was in Walgett, near the junction of the Namoi and Barwon rivers. Once a busy paddle steamer port, the town marks the northern gateway to the opal fields of Lightning Ridge and the epic Darling River Run road trip. From Walgett, we continued to Brewarrina via the Camilroy Highway, crossing the Barwon River not far from Walgett. We stopped at a very dusty and windy spot at North Brewarrina near the Gadooga Road turn-off for morning tea. As we had already visited Brewarrina, we continued on. The road was good with very little traffic. The feed along the road was quite dry in places, with no feed at all in others. We continued on to Bourke, where we had planned to stop and rest. Arriving in Bourke just after midday, we made our camp at Kidman Caravan Park. I spent the afternoon working on photographs while Rick tinkered with the car and greased the caravan. Our third day saw us leave Bourke heading along the Kidman Way to Cobar. Today would see us grapple with the time again as we were leaving New South Wales daylight saving time and entering South Australian time from Broken Hill. Rick and I had not travelled along this stretch of the Kidman Way, so was interested in seeing what the countryside was like. Gundabooka National Park, which we had marvelled at in the distance on our Darling River run, was on the west of the highway. There were long stretches of highway with patches of green pick along the roadside, hence all the goats. We were not sure if they were wild or were farmed, but there were lots and lots of them, and all in good condition. Mustering them would be quite difficult with both the scrub and what little water being so widespread throughout the region. Rick and I found the drive interesting, as it was very different from what we had previously seen. Cobar is a mining town at the junction of the Barrier Highway and Kidman Way. From Cobar, we continued along the Barrier Highway to Wilcannia, where we had a late lunch in the park, before continuing on to Broken Hill, stopping in to look at Little Topar Roadhouse, now closed, on the way. The highway continues as a long straight road from Cobar, with slight changes in the scenery on this section of the road, with its red sand, low bushes, and finally the ranges that gives this outback highway its name, the Barrier Ranges, appearing on the horizon. We stopped in Broken Hill to refuel before continuing on to Coburn, just 50 kilometres past Broken Hill, our first town once we reached South Australia. From Broken Hill, we were now in our third time zone, South Australian time. I was amazed at the changing scenery once we had left Broken Hill with its hills, long sweeping curves, and then open stretches of highway. It really was an interesting stretch. Then again, both Rick and I have enjoyed seeing how vastly different this part of Australia is to where we have previously been. It is truly an amazing country. On leaving Broken Hill, we passed a huge solar farm about 5 kilometres southwest of the town. As Broken Hill has one of the highest levels of solar radiation in New South Wales, makes it an ideal location for the farm. Plus, with a large local population and several industrial sites nearby, there is significant demand for the electrical power in the region. The solar plant occupies approximately 140 hectares, bounded by the Barrier Highway to the north and the Peterborough to Broken Hill railway line to the south. The Barrier Highway is part of the east-west link between Sydney and Perth. It connects Broken Hill with Adelaide and is on the boundary of the Flinders Ranges and outback of South Australia. The highway passes through pastoral stations and the district boasts a rich mining and railway history. The Indian Pacific passenger and freight trains make an impressive sight as they operate parallel to the highway. In the early 1990s, the South Australian government posed to close down the small communities along the Barrier Highway, leading to a strong and unified resistance from the local communities. Most are struggling to survive or have declined to the point of ruin. Coburn was established in 1886 and sits on the border of South Australia and New South Wales. The town came into existence in 1886 as a place where the Silverton Tramways train could exchange locomotives and crew on their way from Silverton to Broken Hill, allowing for the rail transport of ore between Broken Hill and South Australia. As mining wound down around Silverton, Coburn lost its importance and also entered into a fast decline. Rick and I were amazed by the country we were travelling through. To the north of the highway, we were passing through the bottom edge of the Strzelecki Desert, with extremely sparse scenery. The country seemed to be very flat, but was undulating, and we were seeing the top of each rise that stretched as far as we could see. It was an amazing country with wide open spaces, sandy creek beds, and a barren landscape covered with salt and blue bush. So very dry, as there is no permanent waterways in the area, not to mention the isolation. We stopped in at Olari, a former railway town situated on Olari Creek. Rick and I were amazed by the old ruins scattered around the town. This small settlement was established in the late 1880s to service the highway and the railway which passes through here. The town went through a couple of name changes, mainly in spelling, between 1886 and 1896, when it officially became known as Olari.
After the modernisation of transport which travelled between Adelaide and Broken Hill, the village population declined. Not far from the town is the Alari Goldfield, an old abandoned goldfield, which is actually closer to Manor Hill than to Walari. Further on, we stopped at Manor Hill, a former gold mining town in the Alari Goldfields, and is one of the easternmost localities in South Australia. The railway station is one of the most impressive of rail stops along the Barrier Highway. The hotel across the road has been turned into a museum. After a good look around, we continued on to Yunta, that was established in 1887 as a railway settlement. The town has 2 fuel service stations and a hotel. We stopped at the Yunta Centenary Park, where there was some railway relics to appreciate and to cook up what was left of our vegetables, especially the tomatoes, as we were to pass through the quarantine station further up the road. Yunta is the point where the eastern access road to the North Flinders Ranges and Arkaroola leaves the highway, so it was quite busy. The Barrier Highway swings to the south, and shortly after the Hutt Lagoon rest area is the exit to Peterborough. The scenery changes as we left the arid zones of the outback, with the road continuing through the South Australian agricultural region, though I am at a loss as to how they produce anything in such a dry climate. Up until now, water was not a particular feature of the area, while in the range country there are some fractured rock underground aquifers with some spring outlets between Yunta and Alari. For the most part, however, there was very few reliable natural water sources. Our first 5 days of this trip have been mainly through New South Wales and now into South Australia. New country that we had seen was between Burke and Cobar along Kidman Way, and then again from Broken Hill to Peterborough. The stretch of road between Burke and Cobar runs on the eastern side of Gundabooka National Park. The red richness of the soil was staggering, as well as the diversity of trees in the area. Very different to what we had been used to. Travelling from Broken Hill to Peterborough was different again. Once again, I marvelled at how people live and work in this area of Australia. It really does make some getting used to. I remember being told that if I didn't settle in a place after 15 months, then I was never going to settle there. I am not sure if that is still the case, as sometimes, especially with work, we don't really get much of a choice. I found it quite sad that there were still so many businesses struggling to get people to work in these areas when there is so much to offer, if only you are capable of finding the positives of the place. We arrived in Peterborough around 2 o'clock, originally named Petersburg after Peter Dokek, a landowner who subdivided his land and sold it by auction, but the name was anglicised during World War One, when anti-German sentiments were running so high and the government demanded that all German-sounding names be changed. Peterborough developed relatively late in the history of South Australia. Land in the area was not taken up by white settlers until 1875, when the government bought land in the area and subdivided it. The town had its beginnings 4 years later, when it was announced that the railway to Broken Hill would pass through here, becoming a major railway town. By 1880, the Petersburg Hotel and the local post office had been erected. By 1886, the railway connection from Adelaide to Broken Hill was completed. The town grew rapidly through the 1880s, with the town being declared a municipality in 1886 as a railway town at the junction of the Port Pirie to Broken Hill line and the Adelaide to Corn, Port Augusta, Hawker, Lee Creek and Maree line. It is the eastern gateway to South Australia for those coming from New South Wales via Broken Hill. Its greatest claim to fame is that it is one of only 2 places in Australia where 3 railway gauges meet. This particular absurdity was the result of different state governments being unable or unwilling to agree on a standard railway gauge. Today, the town services an important grain growing and pastoral region. It was a great place for us to stop and have some downtime from travelling, as we had spent most of the past couple of days travelling, leaving Coburn on the border with nearly 3 hours travel behind us. The next day we walked down to the Peterborough steam town, the old railway workshop with displays of steam engines and carriages. Formed in 1977, Steamtown was created to run a steam train service between Peterborough and Corn with rolling stock dating from 1920s. The museum's heritage-listed roundhouse with its 23 bays, a 3-gauge turntable, the only one left in the world, and parts of the original workshops now display a wide range of historic rolling stock, mainly from the original Garn, which passed through the town. Rick and I had a very informative guided tour of Steamtown, including climbing in some of the trains on display and the historic transcontinental carriage, now transformed into a viewing carriage and placed on the 27-metre-long turntable. Though neither Rick or I are into trains, it really was a worthwhile experience. So much history in rail transport given by a passionate guide who had lived in the area, adding to the experience with her own stories. It was a wonderful experience. That afternoon, just a short distance south of town, Rick and I visited the Greg Duggan Nature Reserve and Lookout, home to over 70 species of native birds and 60 types of native plants. We had an amazing view of Peterborough and the countryside surrounding it. It was such a dry, windy and dusty place, but a remarkable place, literally in the middle of nowhere. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of our 2024 travels. Join us next time as we continue further into South Australia towards Port Augusta. Take care and stay safe. Cheers for now. Rick and Rosemary, R&R Live and Life.